Welcome back to the curious case where every teacup hides a story. Today, Street Mary Mead hums with excitement for its annual antique fair. Silver trays, lace gloves, clocks that refuse to tick, and one strange piece that stops the crowd cold, a small silver locket. No price tag, just two engraved letters, E.B. Whispers ripple through the hall. Who was she? Miss Marple pauses mid-step, eyes narrowing. She's seen those initials before, on a forgotten obituary from years ago. Her teacup trembles slightly. That name, she murmurs softly, was never meant to be spoken again. Dolly Bantry refused to let it rest. That locket, Jane. It's been haunting me all morning. We must find out who sold it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Curiosity, Dolly, is a fine servant but a dreadful master. Then let me be dreadful, Dolly replied briskly, already donning her hat. We're going to Ashcombe Lodge. The drive was short. The house, long neglected, stood behind iron gates that hadn't been oiled in years. Ivy crept over the stone like slow handwriting. A single window curtain twitched as they approached. Mrs. Elspeth Brant opened the door herself. Thin, pale, dressed in black despite the warm day. "Good morning," Miss Marple began gently. "We're from the Village Fair Committee. There was a locket silver, engraved, found among the display. We wondered if it belonged to you." Elspeth hesitated before answering. "Yes, it was mine once. I shouldn't have put it out." Old things slipped through the cracks. Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. They were watchful, guarded. Dolly, never one for subtlety, leaned forward. "It's quite a lovely piece. You must be heartbroken to part with it." "Some memories," Elspeth said softly, "are better sold." Inside, the house felt too quiet. The air held that faint scent of extinguished smoke, as if a candle had been blown out a moment before. Miss Marple noticed details in silence. A cracked photograph frame on the mantel, dust disturbed on a writing desk, and a vase of roses, every stem cut unevenly by an unsteady hand. "I heard," Dolly began, lowering her voice, "that your husband passed rather suddenly." Elspeth nodded. 2 months ago. Heart failure, they said. I've been trying to put things in order." Her fingers twisted together as she spoke. Miss Marple's gaze, casual yet sharp, lingered on her wrist-faint bruises, circular, fading into the skin. "Gardening accidents are the worst," Miss Marple said gently. Elspeth blinked. "Pardon?" "Those marks," Marple replied, tone mild. "Not from pruning shears, I think." A silence followed, the kind that breathes louder than words. Elspeth turned away, adjusting the vase, though it needed no adjusting. "You should go," she said quietly. "There's nothing here worth remembering." Dolly frowned. "But the locket—" "Keep it," Elspeth interrupted, voice suddenly firm. "It never brought me peace." They left the house in uneasy quiet. Dolly finally whispered, "Jane, what do you make of it?" Miss Marple looked back toward the shadowed windows. Her voice was barely a breath. "Those marks," she said, "weren't from gardening." The Blue Boar Tear Room was buzzing by mid-morning. Teapots clinked, spoons stirred, and the air smelled of lemon sponge and speculation. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward across the table. "They say Elspeth Brant inherited Ashcombe Lodge from some reclusive uncle. Left her the whole estate, can you imagine?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Reclusive uncles have a habit of creating trouble from beyond the grave." "Oh, but there's more. Mrs. Price," Ridley whispered from the next table, pretending not to listen but clearly doing just that. "The will was contested. Family in Devon furious they were. Claimed it was changed weeks before the old man died." The room hummed like a beehive. Every woman in Street Mary Mead could taste the scandal. Miss Marple's eyes remained on her cup. Changed wills often stir the dust of secrets. It's never the ink that matters, but the reason for the rewriting. Dolly nodded. "And that poor woman living all alone in that crumbling lodge? I don't like it, Jane. Something's wrong there." Before Miss Marple could answer, the door swung open. Inspector Slack entered, hat tilted back, expression set to permanent irritation. He spotted them instantly. "Ladies," he said, "I should have guessed I'd find you in the middle of a rumour before the scones cooled." Mrs. Bantry bristled. "We're simply discussing local affairs." Slack grunted. "Local affairs have a habit of turning into official ones when you two are involved." He looked at Miss Marple. "And before you ask, yes, Mrs. Brandt's husband's death was natural. Heart failure. Doctor signed it himself." "Heart failure is a generous diagnosis," Miss Marple replied mildly. "It often covers a multitude of sins." Slack gave a short laugh. "Leave wills to the courts, Miss Marple. You stick to your knitting, and I'll stick to my police work." Mrs. Bantry leaned close. "He says that every time, Jane." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "and every time something dreadful follows." They finished their tea in uneasy silence while the chatter of other tables rose again, each rumour polished and reshaped before passing on. Slack lingered near the counter, pretending to read the notice board but keeping one ear on the gossip. His patience thinned visibly. "I'll be needing a quiet village one of these years," he muttered. Then the telephone rang behind the counter, sharp, urgent. The proprietor answered, nodded quickly, then turned pale. "For you, Inspector," she said, holding out the receiver. Slack frowned, took the call. His tone changed after the first sentence. "Repeat that." "Yes, I'm on my way." He hung up slowly, eyes flicking toward Miss Marple. "What is it?" she asked softly. Slack's jaw tightened. "Ashcombe Lodge. There's been another death." The tea room fell silent. Even the teapot stopped steaming, as though the whole room was holding its breath. Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly, stood up, and reached for her hat. "Come, Dolly," she said. "Our inspector may need a hand with his knitting." The drive to Ashcombe Lodge was quiet. Inspector Slack gripped the steering wheel too tightly. Miss Marple sat beside him, hands folded neatly over her handbag. He broke the silence first. "You know, Miss Marple, every time you turn up at one of my investigations, I end up with paperwork that takes weeks." She smiled pleasantly. "Then let's hope this one is mercifully brief, Inspector." At the lodge gates, a constable waved them through. The front door stood open. Inside, the maid Clara was wringing her hands in distress. "It was locked, miss," she said, eyes wide. "From the inside. I swear it was. I brought the morning tray, knocked, no answer. I fetched the spare key, but it wouldn't turn. Mr. Jenkins from the garden forced it open." Slack's boots echoed on the hall tiles as he entered the study. "No sign of forced entry," he muttered. The room told its story in fragments. A chair overturned near the desk. A teacup shattered on the carpet, its contents dark against the rug. Curtains half drawn, letting in streaks of pale morning light. Miss Marple moved carefully around the room. She noted the details without speaking. One drawer open, papers scattered, the faint smell of smoke. "Who found her?" she asked. "The maid," Slack replied. "Says Mrs. Brandt was already gone when they got the door open. Heart failure again, if you can believe it." Marple's voice was soft. "I believe in coincidence, Inspector, but never twice in the same house." He shot her a look. "Let the doctor decide that." She bent to examine the hearth. The ashes in the grate were fresh, still warm. A corner of charred paper clung to the grate edge. She used a pencil to lift it free. "Something was burned in haste," she murmured. Slack peered over her shoulder. "Looks like a photo." The image was mostly destroyed, the center blackened. But the edge remained intact, just enough to show part of a man's face, a high collar, and a military badge glinting faintly in the soot. Marple studied it closely. This was no random fire. Someone wanted to erase him. The inspector frowned. "The husband, perhaps?" "Unlikely," she said. "From the look of the uniform, this man was young, too young to be her late husband. And she burned it this morning, not years ago." Slack crossed his arms. "Then who was he?" Marple slipped the fragment into an envelope. "Someone, Mrs. Brandt feared, or loved, or both." The maid sobbed quietly in the doorway. Dolly Bantry, who had arrived moments later, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Poor woman," Dolly whispered. "All alone in that room." Miss Marple looked toward the desk, where a fresh cup of tea sat half-finished beside an open book. She wasn't alone, she said softly. Slack turned. Meaning? Marple's gaze lingered on the burned photograph. The tea was poured for two, Inspector, and one of them wore a military badge. The constable had sealed off the study, but Miss Marple was not one to waste a quiet moment. While Inspector Slack took statements in the hall, she examined the desk slowly, methodically. A faint smell of lavender clung to the papers. Old correspondence, most of it dull. Receipts, post-war deeds, dull notes in faded ink. But one envelope, yellowed and thin, was tucked behind a drawer lining. It looked forgotten, perhaps intentionally. She eased it out with the tip of her knitting needle. The seal had long crumbled. Inside lay a single page, folded twice, written in slanted handwriting that belonged to another century. Dolly, hovering at the doorway, leaned in. "Jane, are we allowed?" "Not exactly," Miss Marple murmured, "but curiosity is best served while the kettle's hot." She unfolded the page. The paper crackled. The ink had browned, but the words were legible. "November 1918, dearest Elspeth. By the time this reaches you, the armistice will have been signed. I pray we may all find peace again. But there is one thing you must never speak of, not to the family, not even to him. The baby must never be named. I will send word when it is safe. Until then, trust no one. Yours in secrecy." E.B. Dolly's hand flew to her mouth. E.B. again, the same initials on the locket. Miss Marple said nothing. Her eyes scanned the bottom of the letter again and again. The date, the tone, the fear. "The baby must never be named," Dolly repeated in a whisper. "What sort of thing is that to write?" "Not a normal one," Marple said softly, "but very British, in its own way, hiding shame behind good stationery." Slack reappeared at the door, impatient. "Ladies, this is still an active scene." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple said sweetly, sliding the letter back into its drawer. "We were simply tidying memories." He eyed her suspiciously but moved on. When he was gone, Dolly whispered, "Do you think Mrs. Brandt found it too?" "Almost certainly," Marple replied. And perhaps that's what frightened her most. They stepped out into the hall, where the grandfather clocks struck 11, each chime sharp in the quiet. Outside, a chill wind carried the scent of rain. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter. Dolly was still thinking aloud. A letter from 1918. A baby no one must name. And now, 2 deaths tied to the same house. "Patterns repeat," Marple murmured. "Especially old ones. People forget, but paper remembers." Dolly frowned. "But what does it mean, Jane?" Marple's gaze drifted back toward the shuttered study window. The faintest smile touched her lips, not of amusement, but of realization. "It means, my dear," she said quietly, "that the baby was alive." The next morning, a motorcar rolled up the gravel drive of Ashcombe Lodge. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes, frowning. "Expecting someone, Miss Marple?" She shook her head. "Not at all, though I've learned to expect the unexpected." The car door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, well-dressed, early 30s perhaps. His hair was slicked neatly back, his shoes gleaming in the dull light. He walked with the confidence of someone certain the world owed him a hearing. "Henry Brandt," he announced smoothly, handing over a folded envelope. "Nephew to the late Mrs. Elspeth Brandt. I've come about the estate." Slack accepted the document, scanning it with mild irritation. "You're a bit late, Mr. Brandt. There's been developments." Henry smiled. "So, I've heard. Tragic business. My aunt was a good woman, I'm told." "You're told?" Miss Marple interjected quietly. "You didn't know her well?" He turned toward her, polite smile intact. "Not closely, ma'am. Family ties grew thin after the war. I've been abroad, India, then the colonies." Marple tilted her head. "Ah, a traveller then. And yet your hands," she gestured gently, "not the sort to have gripped many trunks or train rails." Henry's eyes flicked briefly to his fingers, smooth, manicured, faint scent of cologne. The smile didn't falter, but it stiffened slightly. I've had some success, Miss Marple. Miss Marple. Success affords one a few comforts. Slack folded the document. Your papers look in order. Birth certificate, power of attorney, family connection, though I'll have to verify every line. I encourage it, Henry said easily. Transparency always helps in matters of inheritance. Miss Marple's eyes remained on him. Transparency, yes, though some truths prefer fog. He laughed softly, a sound rehearsed for charm. You sound almost like my aunt. She had a way of turning phrases cryptic ones, too, always hiding something in her words. That's interesting, Marple said. You said you didn't know her well. He met her gaze briefly. Letters, he said quickly. She wrote letters now and then. Slack interrupted. You'll stay at the inn until things settle. I'll need to question you further. Of course, Inspector, Henry said, bowing slightly, but if you're searching the house, I might save you some time. My aunt kept her personal effects in the blue armoire near the east window. That's where the silver locket should be. The room went still. Slack frowned. No one mentioned a locket. Henry's smile flickered. Didn't they? She mentioned it in her will, I believe. Something about a family keepsake? Dolly whispered. Jane, how could he know? Miss Marple's gaze didn't move from the man. Yes, she said softly. Quite right. The locket. But only someone who had already seen the inside of that drawer would know where it was hidden. Henry's hand froze halfway to his coat pocket, and for the first time, his smile slipped. Rain had soaked the garden paths overnight. By morning, the grounds of Ashcombe Lodge were a maze of puddles and flattened leaves. Miss Marple stood under her umbrella, watching the old gardener, Jenkins, trim the wilted hedges with slow, deliberate snips. He looked up as she approached. Morning, miss. Miserable weather for pruning, but it keeps the mind steady. Indeed, Marple said pleasantly, and a steady mind often sees what others overlook. Jenkins gave a cautious nod. You mean about the light, ma'am? Exactly that, she said softly. Tell me again what you saw. He set down his shears. It were near midnight, the night before Mrs. Brant was found. I'd been checking the boiler house, the pump's temperamental in the damp. When I looked back toward the house, I saw a light in the study window. Dim, like from a candle. Mrs. Brant was alone in the house, Marple prompted. That's what folks say. Jenkins frowned. But I swear there were two shadows moving across them curtains, one tall, one smaller, moving quick back and forth. Did you recognize either shape? No, miss. I thought maybe her nephew had arrived early, but there was no car then. Only the light and the sound of the latch shutting when it went dark again. Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And you didn't mention this to the inspector? I did, miss, Jenkins said grimly. He said my eyes were playing tricks in the fog, but I know what I saw. Marple smiled gently. You've worked these grounds for how many years? 30. Come Michaelmas. Then I'll take your eyes over fog any day, Mr. Jenkins. He gave a small, proud nod, then gestured toward the side path. There's more. When I came back at dawn, I noticed muddy boot marks near the study window. The soil there holds prints like wet clay. I measured them out of habit. Marple's voice was calm. And? Too small to be the nephew's. He's got feet like shovels. These were lighter, narrow, short. Could be a woman's or a young man's, hard to say. She studied the path where he pointed. The marks had blurred now, washed thin by the rain, but the shape was still visible, distinct, deliberate. Did you tell Inspector Slack? Jenkins gave a rueful grunt. He said the rain could have made 'em shrink. Marple looked toward the house. Rain distorts, yes, but it doesn't invent. They stood in silence a moment, the wind rustling the wet hedges. Finally, Jenkins added, If you ask me, miss, whoever was in that study that night weren't welcome. Mrs. Brant wasn't the sort to burn photos for company. Marple closed her umbrella, eyes thoughtful. No, she murmured, nor the sort to let two shadows fall where one should be. She turned back toward the lodge, voice low and certain. Those muddy prints, Mr. Jenkins. They may yet speak louder than the inspector. Mr. Petherick's office smelled faintly of old paper and pipe smoke. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack sat opposite the solicitor's enormous oak desk, where files were stacked like miniature monuments to the art of bureaucracy. "I appreciate your prompt arrival," Petherick began, his voice low and measured. "This is not a matter I take lightly." "Nor should you," Slack replied. "You said something's missing?" "The official will," Petherick said gravely. "Mrs. Brandt's most recent testament, executed last year. It was stored here, under lock and key." He gestured toward the steel safe behind him. "Yesterday afternoon I opened it to prepare a certified copy for the probate office, and the envelope was gone." Slack leaned forward. "Gone? You mean misfiled?" Petherick shook his head. "I've checked twice. Every deed, every document is where it should be. Only that one envelope missing." Marple's eyes moved to the safe door. She rose without asking, and examined the keyhole closely. "May I, Mr. Petherick?" "By all means, Miss Marple." The steel surface bore faint, uneven lines around the lock's tiny grooves. She tilted her head. "How curious. These scratches aren't from daily use. Someone's been testing a fit, recently." Slack crossed his arms. "Could have been your clerk fumbling the key." "My clerks are not in the habit of testing safes," Petherick said sharply. Marple straightened. "The pattern suggests a copy key was used, filed a fraction too wide. Someone practiced until it turned." Slack's brow furrowed. "You think someone broke into a solicitor's office just to take a will?" "Not just any will," Marple replied. "A document that determines ownership of a very valuable estate, and perhaps silences certain names best left unwritten." Petherick sighed heavily. "The irony is bitter, Miss Marple. The key to this safe has never left my possession. I wear it always." He lifted the small ring from his waistcoat chain. "See?" Marple's gaze softened. "Except perhaps when you leave your coat on its peg at luncheon." Petherick looked startled. "Well, yes. At the club. I hang it in the cloakroom." Slack nodded grimly. "Then that's when it happened. Someone borrowed your key, made a quick impression, and returned it before you noticed." "Do you recall who visited you last week?" Marple asked quietly. Petherick hesitated. "A few clients. Routine business, mostly. Let me think. Oh, yes. Mrs. Brandt herself. She came by on Tuesday." Slack's pencil froze. "Mrs. Brandt, 2 days before she died?" "She said she wished to confirm the will's witness signatures. Perfectly civil, perfectly ordinary." Marple's eyes held a calm, knowing light. "Ordinary visits can hide extraordinary purpose, Mr. Petherick." She brushed her gloved fingertips across the scratched keyhole once more, as if feeling the memory of the metal. Then, softly, "So the last person to see that will was the woman now beyond questioning." Slack frowned. "Meaning?" Marple's voice was steady. "Meaning, Inspector Mrs. Brandt may have stolen her own will." Clara sat stiffly on the edge of the chair, twisting her apron between her fingers. The small sitting room at Ashcombe Lodge was dim that afternoon, curtains drawn to half-light. Inspector Slack paced by the fireplace, impatient. Miss Marple waited quietly, her knitting motionless in her lap. "Start again, Clara," Slack said. "You claim Mrs. Brandt gave you instructions about certain papers." The maid nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. About a week before it happened. She called me to the study and said there were old letters in a drawer, told me to burn them all. Every single one." Slack frowned. "Did she tell you why?" "She said they were personal, private things. I didn't ask." Marple's tone was gentle. "And you did as she asked?" "Yes, miss. I took them to the kitchen stove that same evening." She stood there watching, real quiet-like, until they were gone. "I thought they might have been love letters." "Love letters?" Dolly Bantry, seated beside Marple, perked up instantly. "At her age?" Clara flushed. "I didn't mean no harm, ma'am. It's just—" She looked sad, holding one of them, pressed it to her cheek before she tossed it in. Marple leaned forward. "Did you happen to see any of the writing?" Clara hesitated. "Only one name. It was written on the envelope, in blue ink." Slack took a step closer. "And?" The maid swallowed hard. It said Eleanor Blackwood. The room fell utterly silent. Slack scribbled the name down. Blackwood, relation of hers. Don't know, sir. But she went pale when she saw I'd read it. Marple's hands stilled. The yarn slipped quietly from her fingers to the floor. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did a quick flash of recognition, cold and certain. Eleanor Blackwood, she repeated softly, tasting the name. You're sure? Yes, miss. I remember because she made me swear never to repeat it. Slack grunted. Well, too late for promises now. Marple rose slowly, crossing to the window. The garden outside lay washed with fog, edges blurred and ghostly. Dolly whispered, Jane, you know that name. Yes, Marple said quietly. From another village. Another affair, entirely. Years ago. Slack frowned. A relation to this business? I can't yet say, she replied. But I remember the case. The Blackwoods owned a factory near Whitcomb. There was scandal after the war fraud, missing patents, and a woman who vanished from her home. Slack tapped his notebook impatiently. You're saying it's connected? I'm saying, Marple murmured, that Mrs. Brandt's past was not what it seemed, and someone went to great effort to erase it. She turned back toward Clara, her tone soft again. My dear, when you burned those letters, did any refuse to burn? Clara blinked. One. The edges curled, but it wouldn't catch. I tore it up instead. Marple's gaze sharpened. And where did you throw the pieces? In the kitchen bin, miss. Marple's voice was a whisper now, almost to herself. Then some part of Eleanor Blackwood still remains, waiting to speak. Her eyes met Dolly's. The warmth had left them. She already knew this story once before and how it ended. It was Dolly Bantry, as usual, who stumbled upon the clue by accident. She had been rummaging through the late Mrs. Brandt's wardrobe with cheerful disregard for Inspector Slack's warning tape. Jane, she called, half buried in coats. These clothes could tell stories if they had tongues. Look at this one heavy wool, old-fashioned, smells of mothballs and secrets. Miss Marple appeared beside her, peering at the long grey travel coat. Mrs. Brandt hadn't travelled in years. Exactly, which makes it terribly suspicious that she kept this one so clean. Dolly lifted it out and shook it gently. Something inside rustled. They exchanged a glance. Marple took the coat to the light, running her fingers along the inner lining. Hand-stitching, she murmured. Newer thread. See the uneven seam along the hem? Without hesitation, she fetched her small embroidery scissors from her handbag, a habit born of both knitting and investigation. She snipped the stitches one by one until a narrow fold opened. From within slid a flat, cream-coloured envelope, sealed with wax long, since cracked. Dolly's eyes widened. Jane, we found another will. Miss Marple said nothing. She broke the brittle seal and unfolded the parchment slowly, her expression unreadable as she read. This is my final and true testament. I, Elspeth Brandt of Ashcombe Lodge, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath my entire estate to the rightful son of Eleanor Blackwood. Dolly exhaled sharply. Her son? But Eleanor Blackwood, she vanished years ago. Marple nodded. And Mrs. Brandt burned her letters. Curious symmetry, isn't it? Dolly leaned closer. What about Henry Brandt, then? He said he was the heir. Perhaps he believed it, Marple said. Or perhaps he wished us to. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, Mrs. Brandt's own, in steady ink. The date was recent, just 3 months before her death. Marple folded the paper carefully. This explains why someone needed to steal the other will. It contradicted this one. Someone didn't want a rightful son appearing out of the shadows. Dolly frowned. But who is he? Who could he be? Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where the garden mist curled along the ground. Eleanor Blackwood's child, born in secrecy, hidden for years. If the first letter was true, that child must have lived. Dolly shivered. You mean he could still be alive? Marple nodded. Alive, and closer than we think. At that moment, the front door creaked open downstairs. Footsteps crossed the hall, steady, deliberate. Slack's voice called from below. Miss Marple. You'd better come down. The nephew's asking questions again. Dolly whispered. He's not the heir, is he? Marple's hand closed over the will. No, Dolly, she said softly. Henry Brant isn't the heir at all. The footsteps reached the landing. Miss Marple turned toward the door. Someone else, she said almost under her breath, has been waiting for their name to be found. The next afternoon, Miss Marple invited Henry Brant to tea. Dolly Bantry joined, all smiles and biscuits, pretending to enjoy the man's polished manners. Inspector Slack had agreed to observe quietly from the adjoining library, his patience already worn thin. Henry sat back comfortably, cup in hand, his tone light. I do miss English tea. Abroad, they never quite get the temperature right. India spoils one for flavour, you know. Marple smiled. Indeed, you must have been there quite some time. He nodded. 6 years, off and on. Calcutta, Bombay, and a dreadful stint in Rangoon. Beastly climate. Marple poured another cup. 6 years, you say? That would be from 1919 to 1925. Henry hesitated just a fraction. Yes, roughly. Ah, yes, she continued softly. My nephew was stationed in Rangoon in 23. Perhaps your paths crossed. What regiment were you attached to? The Royal Engineers, Henry replied smoothly. Fine fellows. Of course, Marple said, though the engineers withdrew from Burma after 21. I recall reading it in the Times. A small note on page 5, but quite firm about it. Henry's smile thinned. Yes, well, I moved between divisions. Quite the traveller, Dolly said sweetly. So much movement. But how dreadful to have missed your aunt's letters. She wrote often, didn't she? Henry stirred his tea, gaze steady. Occasionally. I was in remote places. Post took months. Marple's voice softened further. And yet, you seem to know precisely where she kept her locket. A remarkable memory for a man who hadn't visited in years. The clink of spoon against porcelain was the only sound for a long moment. Slack leaned slightly forward in the other room, silent but listening. Henry smiled again, forced now. We all remember childhood things, Miss Marple. I saw her wear it once long ago. Marple looked at him kindly. Memory can be such a loyal servant, unless one asks it to lie. He frowned. I beg your pardon? Oh, it's only that I happen to keep a modest interest in court records, she said lightly. And there was a Henry Brant, same age, sentenced in 1921 for fraud in Manchester, released in 1924. Henry froze. Dolly's cup rattled against her saucer. Good heavens, Marple continued calmly. Which does rather make Rangoon an unlikely destination, doesn't it? Slack stepped into the room. She's right, Brant. We checked that record this morning. Henry set his cup down too quickly. Coincidence. Another man, same name. Of course, Marple said. Coincidences are as common as counterfeit coins, and both shine best under false light. Slack reached into his coat. Enough talk. You'll come with me. Henry's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed smooth. You've no proof I'm not her nephew. Marple's eyes didn't waver. No proof yet, she said quietly. But men who build lies forget the one thing even false heirs leave behind. Henry sneered. And what's that? Marple folded her hands. They're past. Slack's hand closed on the man's shoulder, and Henry Brant, or whoever he truly was, went pale. Miss Marple always said the past never truly vanished. It merely waited in cupboards until someone opened the right door. That door opened the next morning when she called upon Mrs. Evers, the retired nurse who had once worked for the Brant family. Mrs. Evers lived in a modest cottage near the railway line. The small parlour smelled of camphor and rose soap, every surface polished within an inch of its life. She was well into her 80s, but her eyes were bright and sharp as pins. I remember them, of course I do, she said after Miss Marple's gentle introduction. Mrs. Elspeth Brant and her cousin, Miss Eleanor Blackwood. Lovely girls, both, though one carried far heavier burdens than the other. Miss Marple's tone was mild. You were in service at Ashcombe Lodge during the war years. From 1916 till 1920, Mrs. Evers replied. I looked after the household when the men were away. Then, one winter early 18, it happened. Marple waited, hands folded. The nurse lowered her voice. A baby, Miss Marple, born in secret, upstairs in the East Wing. Eleanor was the mother. No husband, no announcement. Only Mrs. Brant and I knew. The doctor came under another name. 2 weeks later, the child was gone. Gone? Adopted quietly, Mrs. Evers whispered. Mrs. Brant arranged it herself. She said it was for the best, too much shame otherwise. The papers were signed under a false surname. I never saw the baby again. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her eyes turned thoughtful. Do you recall where the child was sent, Mrs.? Evers hesitated. I shouldn't say, but the couple were from Street Mary Mead. Good people. Couldn't have children of their own. The husband ran the village grocers for years. Marple's breath caught. The Lanes. Yes, that's the name. Peter Lane was what they called the boy. Clever child, quiet, polite. Marple stared at the teacup before her, as if reading the ripples. And Mrs. Brant. Did she ever see him again? Once, Mrs. Evers said softly. He came to the garden fete as a young man. She stood by the roses watching him walk past. I don't think he ever knew. Silence filled the room. Outside, a train whistle echoed faintly over the fields. Finally, Miss Marple rose. Thank you, Mrs. Evers. You've been most helpful. The old nurse looked uneasy. I kept my promise all these years, Miss Marple. You won't tell anyone, will you? Marple smiled kindly. Only the truth, my dear, and only to those who need to hear it. As she stepped into the cold air outside, Dolly Bantry hurried up the lane toward her. Jane, did you find anything? Marple adjusted her. Gloves, voice quiet and even. Yes, Dolly, I found the baby. The baby? Dolly gasped. Then who? Marple turned to her, eyes calm and certain. Then you've known him all your life, Dolly. By late afternoon, the drawing room at Ashcombe Lodge had turned into a storm of tension. Inspector Slack stood by the mantel, arms folded. Dolly Bantry sat rigid, eyes darting between Miss Marple and her godson, Peter Lane, who looked pale and bewildered. Me? Peter said at last. You can't be serious, Miss Marple. I've never even met Mrs. Brant. Marple's voice was calm. Not knowingly, no. But she met you, Mr. Lane, more than once. She watched you grow up. She even bought groceries from your shop. Slack exhaled. Let's keep this simple. You're saying this lad's the rightful heir? The will says, Marple corrected, holding the document gently, that the estate belongs to the rightful son of Eleanor Blackwood, Mrs. Brant's cousin. That child was adopted by the Lanes under another name. Peter shook his head. I can't be someone else's secret. My parents loved you, Marple said softly, and kept a promise that wasn't theirs to make. The door burst open. Henry Brant strode in, eyes blazing, voice sharp with fury. Enough of this nonsense. Slack moved instantly, but Henry waved a hand. You'll believe a gossiping old woman over blood family? Preposterous. Marple met his glare without blinking. Blood family is precisely what you are not, Mr. Brant. Henry's smile twisted. You think this shopkeeper's child could replace me? I have documents, witnesses' proof. Forged, Slack said curtly. We've confirmed your record. Prison in 1921, new passport under an alias. You played your role well, but the stage is closing. Henry's composure cracked. He lunged forward, grabbing Peter by the collar. You? You'll take everything? You don't even know who you are. Peter staggered back, stunned. Dolly rose with a cry. Henry, stop this. Slack drew his revolver halfway. Let him go. Henry's voice broke into a hiss. It's mine, all of it. She promised me she said she'd make it right. Miss Marple stepped closer, her tone cold and precise. She promised the truth would be made right. And it has. In the struggle, Henry's hand struck the table. A small silver locket slid across the surface, spinning until it fell to the floor with a metallic snap. All eyes followed it. It struck the hearthstone and burst open. Inside, beneath a thin layer of dust and tarnish, lay a curl of fine golden hair preserved like a whisper of time. And engraved beneath it, 2 tiny letters, P.L. Silence gripped the room. Peter stared, trembling. Dolly's eyes filled with tears. Henry took 1 step back, voice hollow now. She kept it? Miss Marple nodded once. She did. A mother keeps what truth she cannot speak. Slack pocketed his handcuffs slowly. It's over, Brant. Henry turned toward the door, shoulders shaking. Not yet, he muttered. Not until everything burns. And with that, he bolted from the room. The night air hung heavy with smoke and confusion. The constables had dragged Henry Brant back to the lodge after finding him near the garden shed, trying to set alight a bundle of old papers. Inspector Slack's temper was already frayed. If I had a shilling for every fool who thought a match could burn away evidence. Miss Marple stood by the window, calm amid the noise. Let him sit, Inspector. The truth tends to rise best when the flames die down. Henry slumped into a chair, face streaked with soot. You think you know everything, don't you, old woman? Marple tilted her head slightly. Only what's left behind by those who panic. Slack folded his arms. All right, Miss Marple, you've been 3 steps ahead since the start. Let's hear it. How? Does it fit together? She turned toward him, voice soft but clear. It began when Henry Brant learned that Mrs. Elspeth Brant was not his aunt at all. He found out by chance, perhaps through the old nurse, or through letters long buried. Somewhere in those ashes he burned was a piece of paper linking Eleanor Blackwood to a child. Henry's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. He saw an opportunity, Marple continued, a false heir to an unguarded fortune. So he forged a connection, new papers, a new name. The real Henry Brant had died young, but records from the war made confusion convenient. He arrived here under that stolen name, prepared to claim what was never his. Slack nodded grimly. So far, matches the record. But the plan was imperfect, Marple went on. He discovered Mrs. Brant knew about the hidden will, the one naming Eleanor's son. She'd intended to reveal it, perhaps even confess her part in the adoption. That terrified him. A living heir meant his entire deception would collapse. Henry muttered, You can't prove that. Marple ignored him. So he planned to silence her. He tampered with her medicine, caused a collapse that looked natural. Then, to erase any evidence, he burned the letters and the photograph one that tied him to an earlier crime. Slack looked up sharply. The forgery case in Manchester. Exactly, said Marple. He'd posed under another name even then, but he didn't realize Mrs. Brant had left to safeguard her will hidden in her travel coat. Henry laughed bitterly. Old women and their sewing, I should have known. Marple's tone softened. She was no fool, Mr. Brant. She left the truth behind, stitched carefully into cloth, as mothers do with secrets. Dolly Bantry, pale but composed, whispered, But why didn't she tell us outright? Why all the hiding? Before Marple could answer, a voice spoke from the doorway, hoarse, trembling. Because I couldn't, it said. Everyone turned. Mrs. Brant stood there, frail but upright, wrapped in a shawl, her face ghostly in the firelight. Slack nearly dropped his notebook. You're alive? She gave a weak smile. Barely. I took less of the medicine than he thought, and I knew he'd return to burn the rest. Her eyes found Miss Marple's. I knew everything, she whispered, and I hid it to protect my son. Morning sunlight slipped through the lace curtains of the Blue Boar tear room, spilling over the table where Miss Marple, Dolly Bantry, and Inspector Slack sat in rare. Quiet company. The village hum had already begun outside, church bells, bicycle wheels, the smell of baking bread. Life, as it always did, resumed its gentle rhythm. Slack stirred his tea without speaking for a long time. Finally, he said, You know, Miss Marple, every time I tell myself I've seen everything, you find a way to prove me wrong. Marple smiled faintly. It's not proof, Inspector, merely observation. Life leaves patterns, we only have to look closely enough. Dolly leaned forward. And what of Mrs. Brant, Jane? Why all the lies? Why hide that child's name all those years? Marple's eyes softened. Because guilt doesn't fade with time, Dolly. It just learns to sit quietly beside you. She carried the secret of her cousin's child, and perhaps her own shame, through decades of silence. It was her way of protecting him, even from the truth. Slack nodded slowly. She's in hospital now. Doctor says she'll recover. I suppose there's mercy in that. Perhaps, Marple said, though some recoveries are only of the body. Dolly sighed. So Peter Lane inherits an estate he never knew was his. Seems almost cruel, doesn't it? Cruelty and kindness, Marple said gently, often wear the same face. He's lost the people he thought were his parents, but gained the truth of who he is. And truth, my dear, weighs lighter than secrets. The three sat in reflective silence. The teapot steamed softly between them, the clink of porcelain the only sound. Slack looked toward the window. So that's it then. Case closed. And you were right again, of course. Marple gave a small, knowing smile. Oh, I'm seldom right, Inspector. I simply listen when others dismiss the quiet things. Dolly poured another cup, her tone wistful. Still, such a price for peace. Marple looked into her tea, voice low but firm. Peace always has a price, Dolly. Because guilt, she paused, meeting her friend's eyes, is a heavier heirloom than silver. Outside, a church bell tolled once, deep and steady, the kind of sound that reminded the village life would go on, even after truth had rearranged it. Dolly touched her friend's hand. You're remarkable, Jane. Marple smiled. Only observant, dear. Remarkable are those who keep living with what they've learned. The scene faded to quiet as the host's warm voice returned. Thank you for joining us, dear listener. Another mystery settled, another truth brought to light. Tell us, what would you have done kept the secret, or spoken the truth? A soft pause. The choice, like the locket, is heavier than it looks.